Hello, everyone, and good evening to everybody, whoever is there online right now with us. And again, what you can say hi in the chat box so I will know how many of you are here right now, and then we'll start. And today it's gonna be really a good session on romantic criticism. As you know, we have been talking about romantic period in our period wise session, which I always take in the afternoon, and we have already covered romantic period. So in this session, what I'm gonna do is that we have actually collected all the romantic critics and important text which is important in your exam perspective. And as you know, like there are bunch of questions, no, like so many questions there that they ask in your exam, especially on romantic criticism, and somewhere around 5 questions you are definitely gonna see in your exam, right? And in previous net also we have seen a lot of question from romantic criticism, especially from Wordsworth, Coleridge, Sade and Keats, and of course Shelley, right? So this session is going to be really good, and I believe that it's going to help you in your exam, right? And in this session, not only we're going to talk about these texts and also these critics, but also what we are going to do, we'll solve all PYQ that they have asked in the past, right? So let's get started and quickly jump into our uh, here into our PowerPoint and notes. So as I always tell you, if you want to notes, you can just write notes in the chat box. I'll share the link like how you can access the notes. And also if you want to WhatsApp me, that's even great. I will get back to you quickly, right? And you can also telegram me, and there I will also provide how to access these notes. And these notes are very important. As you know, today we are taking on chapter 4, which is romantic criticism unlocked. And whoever have our, whoever has the our note on literary criticism theory and culture unlocked, then it's good for you. You guys can go back and take the book, and also you can see what we are doing here. Everything is there already, right? So let's begin. Okay, people are coming slowly. Okay, great. Whoever is there, you can say hi in the chat box, then we'll interact in between. And whatever you have any doubt, you can just simply type your doubts there in the chat box. I'll quickly respond, right? So let's begin. Today, chapter 4, as I told you, romantic criticism. And this is very important session. As you know, there are you're definitely gonna see 5 questions on this session alone, right? So anyway, I can see one. uh, Gausia Sarkuli is already there. Hi, how are you doing? And are you ready for the session? And definitely you're gonna see a lot of questions from this session alone. So let's begin. Anyway, whatever the doubt you guys have, you can just write in the chat box. So anyway, let's get started. So romantic criticism, right? That romantic period actually came very late in England, right? But before it was in France. So what you should know, early 19th century British romanticism introduced what aesthetic concepts, and this actually developed in response to new classical movement. So before that, in our previous session, if you are following us, then you will know that we had a session on new classical criticism, where we talked about Dryden and Pope, of course Samuel Johnson and others, right? So it actually started, romanticism European movement, especially in Germany, that is known as Sturm and Drang. Very important. The French Revolution also marked romanticism, So it's also very important. And you might be thinking like, Wordsworth started with the manifesto, right? Preface to lyrical ballad. But you should know there were a lot of things actually happened before, when it actually happened in England. Like we have Frederick Seligal and August Wilhelm Seligal. They actually found Romanticism. So they are the actual founder of Romanticism, not in England, but in France and other in European period. Anyway, Romanticism began late 18th century in English literature, especially what we marked as like 1798 from publication of lyrical ballads, and preface was added in 1800, right? So this is very important. And as you know, in England we have Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, that we're gonna discuss. And of course, second generation poets, we had Shelley, Keats and Byron. And one of the important composition is Hymn to the Night by Novalis, and Song of Myself in America, right? USA. So what is characteristic? Just whoever is there online, when I ask you just Romanticism, what comes in your mind? Can you just write in the chat box quickly that whatever comes in your mind when I talk about Romanticism? So tell me quickly, whoever is there. Anyway, so I was telling key characteristics. So it has nature, right? It will have emotions, and it will be all about common person and especially childhood. You can see everything in Wordsworth, all these things, right? And then there will be feelings and imagination, of course, aesthetic beauty. We have supernatural, right? Solitude, you can see in Keats' work, of nature, and celebration of individualism that you can see in Walter Whiteman and others, right? And we have of course supernatural element, which is very important, that you can see in Coleridge's which work, the Ancient Mariner, right? And the self and the autobiography, mostly written in the form of their own emotions and feelings in the form of autobiographical poem, right? And it also uses personification. So this is all about Romanticism. Now we'll begin with the founders now, right? Who were the founder? Seligal and Schiller. These two are important. You just have to know that these are German poets and critic, and most basically famous for what? The critical fragment, Athenaeus fragment on what? Incomprehensibility, right? And some of the important work is on the theory of history of the plastic art. So that is very important work. This actually marked the Romanticism in Europe, especially in Germany, right? And his Latin translation of Bhagavad Gita and Ramayana, and he wrote reflection on the study of Asiatic languages as well, right? And Friedrich Schiller, on the other hand, remember the date 1759 1805. You just have to just keep in mind that there were before before Wordsworth, there were a lot of people, and there were a lot of movement. Then it actually came in England, right? So Schiller is important for this aesthetic for education of man. So this work is very important. Again, Schiller was also a German playwright, poet and philosopher, and he developed a complex friendship with Goethe's, already influential, right? Anyway, let's talk about another guy, which is Seligal, and he's actually the brother of August Wilhelm Schlegel that we talked about, that Jena Romanticism, right? Or Jena Romanticism. Okay, so another Schelling is there. So many Schelling, Schiller, Schelling, Schlegel, or all are there. You just have to just keep in mind there were others. That's all. Anyway, let me tell you about him. What is famous on the relation of the plastic arts of nature, right? Remember, relation. So that plastic is actually artificiality, right? And the same thing here is, as you can see, we have theory and history of plastic arts. Again, the same thing it is telling, right? Okay, let's talk about Thomas Paine. We already talked about Thomas Paine in our previous session, so we can just kind of ignore this guy, because we had discussed in our romantic period recently, and we have discussed every single stuff. What we have to know that he has written The Common Sense, very important, and he was active in the French Revolution, and it actually marked what age of reason, popular diced text, right? And of course, the American crisis and the age of reason. So it challenges what institutional religion and questions Bible legitimacy. Okay, these guys we have already talked about it, and some of the question I brought again in this session that we'll discuss at the end of our session. Anyway, Edmund Burke also we have discussed in our previous session. You can just go back and watch. But anyway, what you have to remember of Burke is the reflections on the revolution of France. They always ask question on that. And what he also read, a vindication of natural society, and the reflection on the revolution in France, very important. Okay, our focus will be more on Wordsworth and Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats here in Romanticism, because from that this you get always question. And Mary Wollstonecraft, we are actually gonna discuss her where in our feminist criticism. But here we'll just have a small introduction about a vindication of the rights of women, and it was a kind of you know as you can see here, Mary Wollstonecraft, a vindication of the rights of women, thoughts on the education of daughters. So these all we have already discussed. And Maria or the wrong woman, they have asked question on it also. Vindication of the rights of women, and this was a very important work in feminist criticism that we'll talk about. Now let's come back here, our romanticism. As you know, William Blake, we already discussed about his life, but here what we're going to discuss is critical part of it, right? The criticism. So you might be wondering what criticism he has written. He was a poet and a kind of illustrator and all these, right? Painter and printmaker, but he was also a critic, and that you can see in the marriage of heaven and hell. Very important, because it was composed amid in French Revolution, so that influence it can be seen here, the marriage of heaven and hell. And it actually referenced what Swedenborg's heaven and hell, and collection of text based on biblical prophecies and Blake's personal romantic and revolutionary belief. And what belief it was there. And this poem was started a Rintar roars and shakes his fire. And why we have brought him here, because Blake claims Milton was of the devil's party unknowingly. Remember that, and that question you always get in exam, and that's why we have put the marriage of heaven and hell. So what he said, that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, right? So he was actually the supporter of what? Satan, right? Blake assert that Milton's Satan was truly his Messiah, and most of the book is written in prose except two poems. And Blake describes a poet's visit to hell inspired by Dante, and this device taken from Dante's Divine Comedy and Milton's Paradise, right? So these two are mentioned in the poem. Remember, devil's party without knowing it or unknowingly. Very important that actually you get question based on that usually. Okay, so let's move on and talk about Wordsworth. All the about his life we already talked about it. Like he was a kind of founding member of Romantic age in England, visited Switzerland and France, becoming a fan of the revolution, and wrote poetry, especially what the lyrical ballads, and lived in Dorset with his sister Dorothy, right? And he was also a friend of Coleridge, and the prelude is considered as his masterpiece, and revised the prelude many times, but eventually published by his wife because he died, right? And his famous poem, as you know, I wandered lonely as a cloud. And he was also a poet laureate after Sade's death, right? 1843. Until his death, he was there in 1850. So that's all about Wordsworth. Anyway, if you wanna, you know him in detail, in depth, we had a separate session on William Wordsworth that actually I have taken that few years back, that you can go and watch. Anyway, let's move on and talk about preface to lyrical ballads, and definitely you're gonna see two questions on it, and it's like 100%. Right. So here you should pay attention. And how we're gonna discuss it, we're gonna break it down in several parts, and then we'll understand the preface to lyrical ballads, and what does it, the important quote that they usually ask in your exam. So anyway, remember the preface was added in 1800 edition, and that's the most important question that they usually ask in your exam. And collection expanded to third edition, so that lyrical ballads actually again published in 1802 and then 1807, the different publication. Okay, so as you know, it is actually marked as the manifesto of Romanticism, and Wordsworth and Coleridge created intellectual conversation, and that conversation in Coleridge Biographia, you can see how he replied to the preface to the lyrical ballads, that anyway that we're gonna talk about when we discuss Coleridge literary biographia. Anyway, let's move forward and talk about lyrical ballads, and remember, it contains 4 poems by Coleridge and the rest by Wordsworth. And any poem that you know of Coleridge, you can write in the chat box, so I will know. That's how we are gonna interact. Anyway, Coleridge wanted a preface to clarify their poetic style, so that he added in the 1800 edition. Who? Wordsworth. And he criticized artificiality and aristocratic taste. Oh, our Wordsworth, because before it was new classical, right? And they were more focused on the style, the rhyme, the technique, and all these things. But in Romanticism, what happened? They actually, who? Wordsworth College employed the language of a common man. So that exactly is the movement there. So anyway, that why the preface was written, because he wanted to clarify what kind of language he used, and what was the reason or motive behind using this common people's language. Anyway, so Coleridge conceived the preface, but he never wrote it, but Wordsworth wrote it in 1800 edition. Then he refined it again in 1802 edition. And Coleridge, some of the things in the preface that Coleridge kind of disagreed, and it can be seen in Biographia Literaria, and expressed difference through letters, essays, and later on. And difference between Wordsworth and Coleridge, don't fully clash. And remember, we always break down, right? So that manifesto include 4 guidelines, and these guidelines are important for you, because in the question they might ask you in the like A, B, C, D kind of, an E, and you have to find which one is correct and which are not, right? So anyway, poetry according to 4 guideline, what is that? Suited to ordinary life, very important, ordinary life, right? Remember every single stuff here, because it's gonna help you a lot. Ordinary. Second is everyday language, right? You can write in the chat box so you will remember, or you can just make notes out of it. Anyway, written in everyday language. And what he said, feelings are more important than the plot. So feeling is important than the plot, right? That's the third manifesto. And what is the fourth manifesto? Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotion, takes its origin, emotion recollected in tranquility. So let me break it down for you. What actually does this mean? Okay, suppose you are writing a poem or anything, even it's painting or, even a story you're writing, right? So here we are taking poetry, but that can be applied in other stuff. But here Wordsworth is saying that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotion, takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Kind of, you should, memorize it. It's very important. And let me break it down one by one. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotions. So what does he mean by, suppose you are writing a poem? Okay. uh, okay, let's take an example of Sarkuli. Okay, so that's Sarkuli. Okay, guys, uh, he sometime, just went out in a park, for evening walk, or any kind of park he has gone. And in the park he saw a kind of nightingale or Indian rover or dove or something that, you know he got emotionally attached. I mean, he got inspired of it. So sudden emotion came, right? So that emotion came into him, and then he didn't write it immediately there about the poem, right? What he does, that Sarkoli goes back to his room, sit down, relax, and then think about the emotion that he felt while he was walking in the park. So when he's relaxed, more free, then he recollect all those thoughts what came out, and then write it, that recollected all this and write it as a poem, right? So Sarkoli wrote a poem on maybe nightingale or Indian rover or dove, or maybe a child, playing in the park. And he has written a poem while he got back to his room when he's relaxed. So that is poetry according to Wordsworth. I hope it's clear, right? Clear in the chat box if it is clear to you. And then we'll move forward. Anyway, let's move on and talk about other. So everything is cleared here, right? Ordinary, okay, ordinary life, everyday language, feeling over plot, and poetry is the spontaneous overflow emotion. And then your kind of preface is done, and the rest of the thing that we're going to talk about. So all manifesto and guidelines, I hope that it's clear to you. Anyway, let's move on forward and talk about other stuff. So Wordsworth rejected these style of poetry in the 18th century. Remember, neoclassical era. They mostly focus on what, beautifying it, and mostly about the rhyme scheme, or maybe about all these blank verse, and refining it. But here he was against it, and then he introduced the language of a common man, right? The same language that our Sarkoli has written a poem, right? The language of a common man. So remember, Wordsworth remarked that personifications of abstract ideas rarely occur in these volumes and are utterly rejected as an ordinary device to elevate the style and raise it above prose. So remember, very important, he criticized that 18th century style, the style that other poet like Dryden, Pope, or other have has written, or even Milton, right? He's talking about what the language of common people. So he rejects it. So that's what he's actually remarking here. I hope this line is clear because they ask question on it. Then what the author explains why and how he chooses his poem subject. Like Sarkoli chose a subject like child playing in the park, right? So Wordsworth believes that emotional truth and nature reveal ordinary lives, and he prefers rural life for its simplicity and naturalness. So keep in mind whatever the word is coming, right? Like emotional. So in our romanticism, emotional is there, right? Simplicity is there, natural nature is there. And again, Wordsworth favors the unified population with shared experiences, right? And natural truth, like kind of raw feeling. And he makes ordinary experience seem more extraordinary and lasting. And Wordsworth literature reflect popular, people's simplicity and life's depth. And nature, again, nature is important, illustrate permanence, unchanging truth. Urban life, on the other hand, lacks the permanence that nature provide. So here they are clashing, right? And Wordsworth expresses poetry must derive from where is spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. It takes its origin from emotions and recollected in tranquility. The same thing that I explained, right? The poem in the park. Okay, a poet, according to him, what a poet must describe real life experience with ordinary language. So it's the first manifesto, right? First guideline following here. The poet must throw over them a certain coloring of the imagination where ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual subject, ordinary subject, right? And poet's imagination creates new worlds connecting to reality. And poet observes something that provokes emotion. That is our fourth one, the poetry overflow of emotions. And then what? It collected in tranquility, and that actually is your poem. And what happened next? Poet must recall observations, past experiences. Contemplation is personal, meant only for poet. And reflections, tranquility fades, preparing for expression. Poet distills thought, eliminate some and keeping others. I hope it's clear now. Okay, there are a lot of things here. For example, poetry, according to him, poetry becomes universal expression. And poetry, poet is ready to write and share it with an audience, right? And what happened? Poetry does not come from classical model. Again, he's criticizing 18th century stuff, especially neoclassical period, neoclassical poets, right? And he says what? Poetry doesn't come from classical models or supernatural inspiration, ordinary experience. He's actually stressing here ordinary experience and reflection are kind of essential to poetry. And what happened? Wordsworth examines what his views on poetry and prose, and what he said that heroic and higher art, and something he said about the language of man. He aims to reveal both as sharing and fundamental characteristics of the language of man. Remember the second guideline we have here, right? And he sees both as different from science as he understands it. And because science is a relatively new field that focus on the facts, right? And Wordsworth consider the use of most meter produces force type of, again criticizing what uh, these verses, which are basically like very technical form of it, that because he says that it should be rather naked, right, and more straightforward poetry that shares truth with prose. And Wordsworth, very important, they have asked question on it. Wordsworth exemplify that he chooses to write poetry with a proper and natural poetic diction rather than prose. And at the end of the preface, what happened? Wordsworth writes, they both speak by and to the some same organs. Their affection are kindred and almost identical, not necessarily different even in the degree. And the preface concludes with essential principle of his art, and it is composed of imagination and sentiment in writing, and he will use what natural language in meter or prose. So that's all about, guys, preface to lyrical ballad. I hope it's clear to you, and if it is clear, you can just write in the chat box that it's clear. Anyway, now it's time for us to talk about Biographia Literaria, and it is by St. Coleridge. Remember, the friend of Wordsworth, and he also collaborated in preface to the lyrical ballads, and he attended University of Cambridge. Again, he met Coleridge with Wordsworth 1795, and they became instantly kind of friends. Right. Anyway, we talked about his life and all other poems. Right. Okay, some of the thing that you should know that they have asked question on it. As you know, Wordsworth focused on self and everyday life in poetry, and what they thought pairing these two technique might bring into harmony. Remember, two cardinal. They have asked question on it. The two cardinal points of poetry: the power of exciting the sympathy of reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature, and the power giving the interest of novelty by the modifying colors of imagination. Right. And Wordsworth composed most of the poem, as you know, and Coleridge contributed like Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner and other poems. Anyway, that is life and all, and Biographia Literaria, where you get a lot of questions, and we'll try to kind of unlock his all fancy and imagination, primary imagination, secondary imagination, and all these important stuff. Anyway, I hope you guys are ready now, and remember, you're definitely gonna see one question from it, like 100% you are going from Biographia Literaria. One question will be in chronological order, that is 100% true. I mean, chances are there that you're gonna one chronological, one question will be directly they're going to ask from Biographia Literaria, right? Okay, so meanwhile, just take like 1 minute break. I'll just drink water and then we'll begin, right? Okay, let's come back and talk about Biographia Literature. Remember, these notes are gold mine, guys. You can get it either by, if you want printed, then you can just text me printed version, or if you want soft copy, write soft. I'll share the notes, right? And all in the chat box, or you can just WhatsApp me or Telegram me. Anyway, let's talk about first thing, 1817. So obviously preface is before, so your what is clear, your chronological order, right? 1800 edition. So Biographia Literaria 1817, and there he talked about like Kant's imagination, and he also talked about Schlegel, he talked about Schiller and all these people there, right? Schelling also. Remember, it has two-volume autobiography, and its working title was in the beginning Autobiographia Literaria, but then Biographia Literaria, right? And remember, subtitle is important because they have asked question on it. Biographical sketch of my literary life and opinion, and this actually is allude this title to what, the life and opinion of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman by Lawrence Sterne. Right. So Wordsworth poetry, theory, and Kant's imagination influenced this particular work. Coleridge coined the term exemplastic, and they have asked question, based on that. So in simple meaning, it's a kind of glue, right? Uh, let's take for example. Okay, whoever is writing a poetry, or even it's in the story, so you just think about so many stuff, right? Random stuff in your mind, and then you make it in a proper order, right? and then it creates that plot and the story. So that glue, which connects all these dots, these are exemplistic. So that is very important. Anyway, influences include what? Our Schelling, as I told you, David Hartley, and Coleridge critical work. Remember, 24 chapters. 24 chapters. Very important. Published, written in 1815 to 17, same published also in 17. Okay, so first volume emphasize what? Coleridge philosophical development. So this guy is writing. First, he is talking about von Schelling and other kind of critic, romantic critic, and his development, philosophical development. So he's developing, and he believed in the self-sufficient, self-sufficing power of absolute genius. And he compared talent and genius to an egg and eggshell. Coleridge defined willing suspension of disbelief. And what does that mean? Willing suspension of disbelief. So, exemplastic, as you know, is a kind of glue, right? Which actually kind of, stick together, a kind of all the dots in one, right? So it kind of fixes, it makes the plot and emotions and everything, in order. So that is exemplistic. But what is willing suspension of disbelief? As I told you, suppose you have gone, to watch a movie. Suppose you have gone to watch Avenger, right? Avenger movie in theater or any movie, you know. But why I'm just taking like these kind of science fiction? Because you know that it's not true, right? But when you are in the theater, you are willing to believe these, you know, lies or these fictions or these imagination at the same time, right? While you're watching, you're believing it. That's why you're enjoying it, right? So that willing suspension of disbelief. So those disbeliefs, you're ready to accept it in your mind. So that is your willing suspension of disbelief at the moment. And when you come out, you know that was a science fiction. But at that time, while you were watching and enjoying the movie, how, if you don't, if you just be there in the movie and you don't believe anything is there, in the theater, you won't enjoy the movie. You have to, you have that willing to, kind of believe those disbelief, the suspension of disbelief, to enjoy the real beauty of the movie. So that is your willing suspension of disbelief. So what happened when you read a poem, some poems might be, not true and all, but you're willing to believe. So that is there, suspension of disbelief. So it also referred to as a poetic faith by Coleridge. And this concept allows artists to create worlds separate from reality. So that is suspension of disbelief, as I explained to you through the movie example. Okay, let's talk about the other stuff that or this idea actually originated from Greco-Roman theater, where it enabled catharsis. So while you were, reading that, suppose Oedipus the Rex, right? These are fiction and that so many things happen, but you are ready to believe, to get that feeling, that catharsis, right? So that is suspension of disbelief. Then the concept of untranslatability, that is very important, because they have asked this question in your recent exam. I'm talking about just, that cancelled exam. They have asked about that, and that we had already in the notes, right? So if you have read it, then it would have been easy for you to answer. Remember the concept of untranslatability. And what does that mean? The infallible test of blameless style in untranslatability into other words of the same language without damaging to its meaning. So, and now this is all about the thing that they have also asked in the exam. Now let's move to important chapter, which is chapter number 14, and where you get a lot of stuff. For example, two cardinal points of poetry, and they have asked question based on that. And these two cardinal points are what? Or poetry are what? Evoke sympathy in the reader. So while you know I was reading a poem, the same, the park and all, right? So evoke sympathy. So I have the sympathy, Sarkoli, the guy who has written the poem, right? For our example. And while I was reading, I kind of, that poem evoke kind of sympathy in me. So that is the first cardinal points of poetry. Evoke sympathy in the reader by faithfully adhering the nature's truth. The second cardinal point of poetry is what? Expresses nobility by what? Modifying with imagination's colors. Very important. And subject for these poems were to come from where? None other than the just common people's life or ordinary life. And what he else said about it? The second type of poetry where the incident and agents were supernatural. And these two cardinal points are the subject of the poem in the lyrical ballads as well. And Coleridge defended this, Wordsworth poetic creed in Biographia Literaria. But he not only defended Wordsworth, but he also disagreed with some of the ideas like the poetic diction. So Coleridge supported lyrical ballads, language of real life. So I hope chapter 14 intro is clear. And in the chapter 14 itself, not only two cardinal points of poetry, but also what we have, fancy and imagination. They are completely two different things. As I told you, remember the plastic fancy and all, Sheller and selling. Remember that? So that actually he's replying here. Kant, Fish, and Schelling coined the definition of imagination. As you know, an imagination and fancy differs fundamentally in kind, and there is no creative power in fancy. So when there is a fancy in the poem, there is no creativity, in it. There is no power of creative, power, and fancy only combines what? Perception into beautiful shapes. But imagination does not merely fuse or unify this perception, but what it does, that mechanical mixture and chemical components, they differ similarly. And what he said about the imagination, that primary and secondary imagination, two forms of imagination. What? Primary and secondary. And what is primary and secondary imagination? So first let me tell you about the fancy. So fancy means what? Inferior to imagination. This is all about, exterior part of the poem. There is nothing inside it. No imagination is there, right? In the fancy. So fancy is a creative power, but less than imagination. It combines these, different shapes into one, but not fusing them. An imagination, what? It fuses different element into a unified whole. That is your exemplastic. Remember, fancy brings together dissimilar images from different sources. And on the other hand, what is primary imagination? Primary imagination kind of, a little bit different from fancy, especially in nature and function. And Coleridge defines two forms of imagination, again primary and secondary. And primary imagination perceives what? The external world through senses, right? Remember this line: primary imagination perceives the external world through the senses. So we use primary imagination to perceive things daily, and it perceives objects in both their parts and whole. And primary imagination is in what? Involuntary acts of the mind. So the mind receives impressions and sensation unconsciously, and primary imagination imposes order on sensory impressions, and it shapes sizes, impression, and clear perception. On the other hand, what is secondary imagination? That this is where what comes, the poet come, right? Secondary imagination is unique to artist and creator. Remember, it enables artistic creation. It's more active, require conscious effort, and primary imagination works with what is perceived, like the raw material, the raw sensations and impressions. And secondary imagination selects orders and reshape those raw materials. So in primary imagination, what happened, you think about something, right? You imagine something and it's there. But in the secondary imagination, you take that imagination and turn into a beautiful object, and that is your secondary imagination. And that secondary imagination is what connected with exemplistic power, and that actually shapes and modifies external objects. So as I told you, all these dots, right, the these combines, no, and make a poem, and that is your exemplistic, as I told you earlier. And what does this mean? It means it dissolves, then diffuses and dissipate in order to create. So there the secondary imagination has what? Dissolve, diffuses and dissipate. They have asked question on it, and they ask all the time this particular question. So that is very important, and you're definitely gonna see one question on it. And all poetic activity is based on, so whatever the poem you see now, they are secondary imagination according to Coleridge, and it harmonizes opposites like magical synthetic power. Okay, it also imagination integrates soul, perception, intellect, and will, and fuses internal with external, subjective with objective. And what happens also, it connects the human mind to external nature. So, guys, that is all about. And also, imagination blends emotion, intellect, and perception. So, I hope the Biographia Literaria is clear for you. Every single stuff that they have asked in the past and that they are gonna ask in the future also. So, these things are very important that you should always kind of, remember. And if you have made a note, it's good for you. And if you want a note, you can always text me. Right now, let's talk about John Keats. Let's see what is the time right now. 47 minutes. So I guess let's see if it's possible to finish. We'll do it. Anyway, John Keats, we already discussed about his life. As you know, he's the second generations of romantic poems. Remember that he died because of tuberculosis and at a very young age, which was 25 somewhere. And Keats was heavily loaded with sensuality and all these emotion. As you know, in romanticism we have very important one, that is emotions, right? Another part of it, according to Wordsworth, you have seen it. And some of the notable poem that you already know and we have already discussed in our previous session, that you can go and watch: Ode to Nightingale, Ode to On Creation Urn, Sleep in Poetry, on the first looking into Chapman's Homer. Okay. uh, why is Keats, just wait a minute, I think John Keats twice. Okay, let's talk about Keats, then we'll move to Sade. So the Keats, why Keats is important here? Because of his letters. Letters to who? Bailey, George, and Thomas Keats, Tyler, and Woodhouse. All these are important. Remember, he has written not only the poems but also 252 letters in his lifetime, and the lifetime is what, 25, very young age. So kind of he has written a lot of stuff in his life. And then his egoistical sublime describes Wordsworth's self-centered poetry. And Keats used the phrase in 1818 to a letter to Woodhouse. Very important. It refers to Wordsworth's narrative voice conveying his. Just wait a minute, I'm getting a call. Wait. Okay, guys, whatever the doubt is there, you can just ask me in the chat box. Okay, how many of you are there? Okay, guys, so let's come back here. Okay, so we were talking about the letters, right? Keats' letters. Remember 252 letter, and he talked about egoistical sublime, about that Wordsworth self-centered poetry. As Wordsworth said, right, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotion collected in tranquility, right? So as I explained earlier, what is this tranquility and you know overflow of emotions, and here Keats criticized it about Wordsworth tranquility and that self-centered poet. He said about him, egotistical sublime. And what does he mean by that? So remember, suppose you know there is a person, right? Suppose there is a guy or one of your friend, he always talks about himself, like what kind of thing he desire, what kind of thing he should be, and all these stuff, all about himself, right? And all these things. So that is kind of egotistical, sublime, you know, Wordsworth self-centered poetry. That's what exactly what he described about Wordsworth, the overflow of emotion about the poetry, according to Wordsworth, what it was, right? Overflow emotions collected in tranquility. We already talked about it. Anyway, let's move on forward. Let's move forward, and it refers to Wordsworth narrative voice, conveying his singular truth. And what he said, Keats contrasted with negative capability as the ideal. Like in Shakespeare's sonnet, exemplified that negative capability. And that negative capability actually made him a great poet, according to him. And Keats believed in less self centered and more imaginative poetry. So negative capability is what he first thing you should know that they always ask in the question that it was in the letters, and he has written this letter, to his brother on 22nd December 1817, and he was influenced by Shakespeare's work, and then he described about the negative capability. And when this capability comes, when a writer or a poet or whoever is being in uncertainties, kind of in situation where he's not certain about it what's going to happen, all the mysteries and the doubts. That's why we have a lot of what Hamlet's soliloquy, right? So this is also a great example of negative capability. So negative is not kind of a negative stuff, but it actually helped him to become write a great drama and also the poetry, and it's kind of artistic potential. A negative capability explains why great writer accept these uncertainties, right? And it describes the pursuit of artistic beauty over philosophical certainty, and philosopher and poets use the term to explain truth beyond reason. And Keats used negative to capability what to express his potential in absence of possession. Very important, right? So that is negative capability. So he not only introduced negative capability, but also ego egotisticals sublime. Very important. They have asked question on it, right? uh, and then let's go back. We were talking about Sade. So Sade, you should only remember one thing about him. Here is what a vision of judgment, where he criticized who? Byron and Shelley, both of them, right? And what he said about them: monstrous combinations of horror and mockery, lewdness and impiety with which English poetry has been polluted. So he said they kind of polluted English poetry, and they call them what? Satanic school. They are from the satanic part of school. And Byron replied what? uh, the with the vision of judgment. So remember, a vision by Sade, the vision by Byron, right? And it also asked about the Ottawa Rima. Okay, Byron and Shelley works exhibit what? Satanic spirit of pride and audacious impiety. They have asked question on this many times, right? So that's what you should know. Now let's move about Thomas Love Peacock. So Peacock, as you should know, that his work was influenced by P.B. Shelley, and they were close friend also. Remember, he's famous for the ages of poetry. Remember, four ages. And what are these four ages? We'll talk about it. And that actually inspired Shelley to write Defense of Poetry. Okay, so he defended them publicly from criticism elsewhere, and M.H. Abraham put it like, if he was a poet who mocked poets from utilitarian frame of satirical references, he was utilitarian what? Who turned into ridicule the belief into unity and march. So what you should know: the four ages of poetry by Thomas Love Peacock, and that inspired Shelley to write the Defense of Poetry. Very important. And he says the poetry as created by Award, always ready to celebrate the strength of the king's arm, being first duly inspired by that of his liquor. Anyway, that's what you have to know, and that's enough. Next, P.B. Shelley, as you know, today we have discussed P.B. Shelley in detail. That you can go and watch about his life. As you know, he influenced like Browning, Swinburne, Hardy, Yeats, and he was a romantic poet. Everybody know, but later generation, not the first one, but later romantics they are called. And Harold Bloom called him what? Superb craftsman and lyric poet. And he was one of the most advanced skeptical intellect. Right. Anyway, that was all about his life. Anyway, we have discussed and all these poems that he has written. So we can just skip. We can just move here to the Defense of Poetry. Let me see what's the time now, and if it is 1 hour already, then we'll start tomorrow a Defense of Poetry, and all the questions, because there are a lot of questions that anyway we have to discuss, right? So guys, that's all for today. Tomorrow we're gonna continue this session, and I thought in 1 hour it'll complete, but again there are a lot of stuff that we need to discuss, and we need to discuss it thoroughly, because 5 to 6 questions are kind of coming from this session alone, right? So thank you so much, and again, like, subscribe, share, and comment. These things what I want from you, nothing else, right? And if you want all these notes, then I want something, right? So you can just uh, write notes in the chat or in the comment. I'll get back to you, or you just simply WhatsApp me or Telegram me. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Anyway, thank you so much and take care. Well, I'll see you tomorrow, and we'll discuss the same stuff, right? Thank you so much and take care. Okay, let it be 1 hour. 56, 57, 58, 59, 60. 1 hour done. Now I'm gonna go, and good night, guys.